Good morning, Young Atlanticist. Very happy that you came here today in the morning. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome today Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, former Secretary of State, a grand friend of Poland. And I want to underline it from the beginning. What I want to say is that we are very thankful, Madam Secretary, for what you did for Poland, for what you did for Central Europe. Just briefly, I will introduce Madam Secretary. Madam Secretary was the first female in the United States to become the Secretary of State from 1997 to 2001. Before that, she served as the permanent representative of the United States to the United Nations. And before that, in the 80s, this is a very funny story, in fact. She decided to come to Poland in times where everybody in the world thought that Poles are eating kids. Like, to give you the comparison that President Saakashvili did yesterday. Because in the 80s, seriously, Poland was in big problems. And you, Madam Secretary, decided to visit our country. She decided to write about the rise of the Solidarity movement, the importance of media and the Solidarity movement. And we ended up, the whole story ends up in 1999 with independence. So in independence, she signed, we entered into NATO in independence. So this is the big thing. This is the best thing that we got from the United States in the last century. How I learned about you, Madam Secretary, is thanks to my mentor, so Professor Geremek. I remember that at one of his lectures, he was describing to young Polish people that had no idea what NATO is. And he said that we enter into NATO thanks to the A-team. I don't know if you have known that you have been in the A-team, but you have been. A-team means late Ron Asmus and you, Madam Secretary. So this is why you ended up also in a Polish TV series called The A-team. As you know, she served also as the leader of the Wise Men Group, NATO Special Committee that drafted a report that was the foundation of the new strategic concept, NATO strategic concept. So, Madam Secretary, if you could start the conversation right now, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here with Young Atlanticists, since I'm an old Atlanticist, and have the opportunity to lay out a few things for you, and then mostly look forward to your questions. You talked about my being in Poland in 1980. I can't resist telling the story. I was there in November 1981, shortly before martial law was reimposed, and what was interesting was that was the first time I met Lech Wałęsa, and I saw him not long ago when there was the 10th anniversary of the Community of Democracies that we were celebrating in Kraków. And he said something that many people think but haven't actually said to me. I said to him, I first met you when I was here, and it was in the Holiday Inn just before you went to speak to the workers in Nowa Huta. And he said, if I had known how important you were going to be, I would have paid more attention to you. My relationship with NATO is a lifelong one, and let me just quickly outline it. I was born in Czechoslovakia. My father was a Czechoslovak diplomat, and the truth is that the U.S. was not, I think, paying enough attention to what was going on in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, as the Soviet Union was practicing its salami tactics in putting the satellites together, until the Czechoslovak coup in February 1948. And that kind of pushed the West to think about what to do, and NATO was founded in 1949. And so that was kind of the first link that I can think of from as a child growing up. And then obviously I went to college at some point between the invention of the iPod and the discovery of fire, but we really did in fact study all kinds of various groups. alphabet soup. NATO was one of them, and NATO is one that has survived. CENTO, CETO, and various other groupings have not. And it is the most amazing, I think, military alliance and political alliance in the history of the world. It is therefore kind of, life is very peculiar, and the fact that I was in office at a time when we did expand NATO, and I have to say that it was a personal thrill for me to be able to be the person that welcomed Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into NATO as kind of the first stage of expansion. And then I was the first Secretary of State to really take NATO to war in the Balkans. And so I spent an awful lot of time thinking about NATO and what NATO's capabilities were. We also were involved in putting together the Partnership for Peace, which was something that was a very important kind of path to membership, and trying to figure out various ways that NATO could expand into other areas and fulfill its mission. What was most interesting in terms of the time that we were in office was actually trying to explain to President Yeltsin that NATO expansion was not against Russia. And when I met with him, he said, you don't need NATO because we're a new Russia. And I said, well, it's a new NATO. And I think that continues to be an issue of trying to explain to the Russians that it's a new NATO. Dominic mentioned my role in the strategic concept. What happened, as you all know, is at the 60th anniversary in Strasbourg-Kiel, the heads of state decided that they needed to have a new strategic concept, that Secretary General Rasmussen should put it together, but they also decided that there should be a group of experts to help put it together. Each of the 28 countries named an expert, and the U.S. named me. And then Mr. Rasmussen decided that the group of experts would be composed of 12 countries, automatically irritating 16 countries. And then he asked me to chair it. So, and it was, I think, one of the most interesting exercises that I've been involved in, because what we did, and let me just lay it out, and then, because I think it does form a good basis for discussion, is we first had a seminar in which we had 4 different seminars. And in the first one, we put all the problems of the world that we could think of on in terms of what were the issues that had to be solved, from the high Arctic, cybersecurity, civilian approach to follow up on military aspects, everything you could think of. The second seminar was trying to draw lessons out of what had happened in the Balkans and what was happening in Afghanistan in terms of developing this whole idea about a comprehensive approach, which meant both military and civilian acting together, how that worked, what the lessons learned were out of it. The third seminar was looking at partnerships, and it's interesting that what was clear was that there were more partners than there were members. And we began to talk about kind of a Lego concept of how partnerships fit in. And I have to say that what is happening in Chicago as we speak is an example of the number of partnerships. In many different ways, ISAF is a combination of partnerships and also dinner that I hosted. I'm co-chair of the host committee last night in terms of the number of countries that are partners and organizations that are partners. And I think that is a very important new issue, new development as far as NATO is concerned. And then the fourth seminar was about military capabilities and what actually could be done. So then we got together and we did write down what we saw as experts as the new strategic concept, a lot of which had to do with the fact that you couldn't do everything. So looking at the high north, that didn't seem like something that NATO really could do. We talked about whether a cyber threat was an Article 5 threat or not, and we can talk about that more. And laid out what we thought NATO should be doing, a lot in the out-of-area aspects, thinking about that there needed to be responsibility out of area. Funding, certainly spent a lot of time on that. And what then happened was the Secretary General picked up a lot of the ideas out of the strategic concept and took them to Lisbon. And I think it was a very interesting process. So happy to talk about whatever part of it. I do think that there are other aspects, and I know you all have been talking about this, and let me put this on the table, is the whole idea of responsibility to protect. Most of the things I do in my own head, they do come together. To other people, they sound crazy, but I have followed up on a number of issues that interested me as Secretary of State and others that have evolved since. And I was asked, along with former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, to do a task force report on genocide prevention, early prevention of genocide. And we suggested a number of different things that needed to happen. One of them has been taken up by President Obama and now institutionalized, was an atrocities prevention board that kind of talked about how set up an interagency mechanism for early warning. I won't go through all of that, but then the follow-up on that is a task force that I'm doing now with a Chicagoan, Rich Williamson, on responsibility to protect, under the auspices of the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Holocaust Museum and Brookings. And we are looking at a concept that has now really been evolving from the way peacekeeping operations changed in the 90s to human security issues to R2P and what has happened in Libya and discussions about whether it's applicable to Syria. So those, I think it's worth whatever you want to talk about in that. What we have found is it is definitely, as a result of information technology, a new and vibrant issue in terms of if something is happening in X country and the leader is not protecting his people, then what are the responsibilities of the international community? But, and this is a big question, and how it gets applicable to NATO is who carries it out? And the real question we're asking ourselves is whether what happened in Libya, which the UN resolution actually is under the concept of responsibility to protect, whether it helped or hurt the concept, and what people think about the way it's evolving. So those are kinds of the issues on the table. I do think, I fully believe that the Atlantic relationship and NATO must continue to be a major tie and a major political and military concept and action for the 21st century. And I personally do not think that additional expressed interest and activity in the Pacific in any way detracts from our relationship with the Atlantic community. And so that's kind of just by way of introduction. I clearly have plenty to say. So,
quite sure. Madam Secretary, you mentioned partnerships. I want to ask you a question from a Central European perspective, because this is what strikes me the most. Like you mentioned at the Bronislaw Geremek lecture that, let I quote you, perhaps the cliche is valid that the Americans are from Mars and the Europeans are from Venus, but we should remember, according to the methodology, that Venus and Mars got along very, very well. And you said in the end they did it because they had a lot of children. And right now I'm thinking that Mars is trying to convince Venus that we need another child, and this child is called Asia-Pacific region. And from the European perspective, especially from the Central European perspective, we know that our security is not fully assured. This is why I want to ask you a question like, what are your recommendations for Central Europe to become part of the profit and an active, let's say, also participant of your shift towards Asian Pacific region? We want to be there, but how to do it?
One of the good things about no longer being Secretary of State is that I can actually answer your questions, and also that I'm not a diplomat anymore. First of all, I do think that one of the things that is important to recognize is that with the expansion of NATO and the joining basically of Central and East European countries as full partners in NATO, it is a responsibility. And one of the issues that when we first started talking about partnership for peace, and then for some countries and then going into NATO membership was that it's not a scholarship organization. It is, or philanthropic. It is a military alliance in which the member states have a responsibility. And that a lot of that is determined by what the threat is and what the contribution is. I think that one of the things that has happened, I'm asked about this a lot, is that why is there not enough attention paid still to Central and Eastern Europe? And my answer is because you are no longer the problem. You are part of the solution. And I think that what Americans want to see is a very strong partnership between Europe and the United States in terms of dealing in other areas that are threats to all of us. I think the threats are very different. I happen to believe that Russia is not our number one geostrategic threat. That is living in the past. I think that we have other threats that are dispersed around the world, and they are a number of different issues, some obviously terrorists, some the cyber threat, some just general instability that has in the 21st century the danger of spilling over into a number of different areas, and that there is this common responsibility. For instance, I think as one reads about things that are happening in the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea in terms of pirates or in terms of sea lanes or generally kind of that we are part of this together and that the Europeans and NATO also has an action there. I know people are kind of focused on Afghanistan, but the bottom line is Southeast Asia and South Asia do in fact together in many different ways kind of explode with areas that affect everybody. And I think we need to explain it better. But I do think the Europeans have an awful lot of interest in what's happening in Southeast Asia also.
So how would you explain it to the European public? Because this is the problem that you're right now focused on. You have to explain it. How would you do that?
Well, I think that, first of all, if I may say so, I don't think that the politicians in Europe have explained much to their people at all. In terms of what the financial crisis was about, I think that when the Lisbon Treaty was being proposed, it was just kind of a, go for it, this is what we want. And I think the problems have been is that there has not been enough explanation when there have been referenda asked for and then nobody really knows what it's about. So I do think there needs to be a better, and it's very hard, the United States did not invent democracy. But the bottom line is that democracy does require a relationship between the rulers and the ruled, or the government and the people in terms of explanation. So there has to be generally more explanation given about what's going on. I think that part of the problem is that generally, certainly it's true of the media in the U.S., but it's also true in Europe, is not enough of a full story about what the issues are. I think that one has to explain the interdependence of the world, that a great deal depends on economic health, that the economic health of countries also depends on the stability within those countries. I would talk about the problems of terrorists. I'm always a little loath to do this because I don't think we can live in a state of perpetual fear. But the bottom line is that a lot of the kind of political ties that NATO has are helpful. The importance, I think, of explaining that what happens in one part of the world affects another, and that there are issues such as terrorism, such as economic weakness, political weakness that affects everybody.
I think right now it's the time because Madam Secretary said that the Q&A session is the most important one, so can I please, please remember to introduce yourself and be as concise as you can. Okay.
Thank you for being here. It's an honor to meet you. I'm Ahmed Wahid, from Young Atlanticist from Afghanistan. I have a question. While you were a former Secretary of the States during the 1990s, why do you think the U.S. didn't have a clear foreign policy toward Southwest Asia, mainly Afghanistan and Pakistan? And why do you think the U.S. didn't pay enough attention or sufficient attention toward that region? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think that the problem began before us when the first Bush administration did nothing about Afghanistan after the Soviets were pulled out. That was the initial problem. As a matter of fact, I'd like to go back on something. I think the story of Afghanistan, I am a professor, so forgive me here, is that the story of Afghanistan is a story of unintended consequences. I was in the Carter administration when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. I think that there was it was interesting because we were trying to figure out how to punish the Soviets before we could push them back. And I was in interagency meetings, in fact, where people were trying to figure out what tools to use. So we did things like have a grain embargo and stop fishing rights. We didn't send our athletes to the Olympics. We had a call-up for the draft, a number of different aspects. Then what happened was Zbigniew Brzezinski went to the Khyber Pass. There were a lot of mujahideen there. He was there with an automatic weapon and said, God is on your side. Then what happened was that the Reagan administration began to fund the mujahideen in a number of ways and provided a lot of Stinger missiles. Then the Soviets were pushed out. Then no attention was paid to it. Our issue during the Clinton administration was that it was trying to figure out who was in charge in Afghanistan. There were issues between the Northern Alliance and then trying to figure out the Taliban that had arisen. And one of the reasons that we did not want to recognize anybody was their treatment of women. I can tell you that flat out. That was one of the issues that we dealt with. And so it was a problem. Pakistan was a different one. And it's worth telling you this, is that part of the issue was that there were a series of automatic sanctions resolutions that came on when Pakistan did something that, as the executive branch, the legislative branch, had put on in terms of if there were any nuclear activities. There was the Pressler Amendment that came in. Then when Musharraf took over the government, then there were another series of sanctions that came in and made it difficult to have a relationship. And in many ways, that is the issue with Pakistan. But there's no question that we spent a lot of time on the area, but I think in many ways did not have a policy that pushed in the right direction. President Clinton was the first one in a long time to go to India, and in terms of trying to kind of disconnect the Indo-Pakistani relationship. So we tried a lot of different things, but I think that there was not enough movement. I would agree with that. And then 9/11 happened. But we tried so hard to get the Pakistanis to push the Taliban and Al-Qaeda out, a number of different things, but it was a very slow process.
Benedetta?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Benedetta Berti. I'm a Young Atlanticist from Italy. We're very honored to have you here today, so thank you for your remarks. I just have a very quick question about R2P, since you addressed the issue. I remember reading around 2008, you were saying that following the hype, so-called, of humanitarian intervention in the 90s, we were somewhat witnessing the resurgence of the concept of sovereignty as absolute rather than contingent. So on that line of thought, I was thinking, what do you think we stand, where do we stand today, given the rise of R2P and its successful application, some would argue in Libya, and its failure of lack of application in the case of Syria? Thank you.
I think that it's a concept in evolution, in development, and I think we're learning a lot about it. There is no question at all about the fact that people are distressed, offended, in a state of uproar when they see leaders saying that their people are rats or cockroaches or going out and killing them. I think the issue has been the following, and I'm tracing this also. There are those who will say, I would not be one of them, that people didn't know what was happening during World War II. And so the idea all of a sudden that we do know what's going on has changed the situation. It certainly was the case in the Balkans when we began to know what the Serbs were doing to the Bosnians and the Kosovars. And so there began to be a way of thinking that one had to deal with it. And the issue really was, it was called humanitarian intervention. It's interesting, people don't like the word intervention, so protection is that's what responsibility to protect is a little different than humanitarian intervention. The issue always was what the sovereignty question. How do you deal with sovereignty? So the idea came about that if there was an international mandate, that would help kind of deal with the sovereignty issue. We knew, as a result of all the talking that I did, was that the Russians were going to veto whatever we wanted to do in Kosovo, which is why we went to the UN, to NATO, which still meant that it had a multilateral aspect to it. And having the multilateral part, I think, helps the sovereignty issue. On the other hand, the reason that we do not have more action on Iran and Syria, or Syria specifically, has to do with the fact that the multilateral organization, the UN, can't do anything about it because the Russians and others are concerned about sovereignty. So there really is, that is a direct barrier that is there. And it's interesting, the U.S. is in some ways in a tough position. We are very protective of our sovereignty. And I use this example because one of the things that people talk about with R2P is that it isn't over just a military, some kind of act of a human being versus his or her people, but also natural acts of nature. So is there a responsibility to protect when, for instance, there was the cyclone in Burma and they didn't allow help to come in? And so I use this example with my students, which freaks them out a bit. But the bottom line is, I happen to believe that the U.S. government did not do enough to help the people in New Orleans over Katrina. That there were people living under bridges and not enough was being done. What would we have done if all of a sudden the Chinese had said, we're here to help you? So I think that there is, it's a much more, I am a great believer in R2P, but it's a much more complicated concept, and it has to do with the bumping up against sovereignty. Does it help if there's an international mandate? What if you can't get it? And then who carries it out? But it's interesting to watch the evolution of it. And the part in Libya is also an interesting part, because what they're saying, there was an international mandate, but to some extent what happened was that there was some military action that seemed to go beyond just protecting the civilian lives. So.
Thank you, Ms. Albright. My question also has to do with the Syria problem. Under the right to protect and President Assad not neglecting his own people and the non-peace accords, what can the world do, or even NATO do, without a Security Council resolution?
Well, first of all, I think that the issue is, this is always irritating to say, but every one of these cases is slightly different. There can be a various doctrine, but it has to be applied properly. The course I teach, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? So the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And there are not a lot of tools in it, frankly. And the reason that I came up with the course goes back to the answer that I gave on Afghanistan. And that is, there's diplomacy, bilateral and multilateral, and then the economics tools, the carrots, trade and aid, and the sticks of sanctions, embargoes, etc. The threat of the use of force, the use of force, intelligence, and law enforcement. That's it. I think that what is going on vis-a-vis Syria at the moment is they're actually going through the toolbox, and that, in fact, there is an attempt to use the economic tools as strongly as possible, and then also give assistance in terms of non-lethal assistance in a variety of different ways, and trying to use the international community to put pressure on Assad and isolate him. And I think that there is as I understand it, the force tool, the President has asked the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs for contingency plans. So in effect, there's the threat of the use of force that is out there, and continued shining the light on what is happening in Syria. But the question that people have is, and this is just a legitimate question, whether adding more weapons, for instance, by supplying the opposition groups with weapons, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does it add to the civil war? I think that what is going on that makes it different from Libya is the location, the sectarian composition of Syria, the problems of explosion versus implosion in terms of how it plays out in Lebanon and in other countries. So I think they are, whether they know it or not, going systematically through the toolbox and looking at different ways. And then the diplomacy that is going on, trying to persuade the Russians that it is better in the long run for Assad to go. But then it obviously gets into a lot of other areas. But that.
Good morning. My name is Cassandra Gatto. I'm with the Chicago Young Professionals Group here at the invitation of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We know that you were at the Shadow Summit yesterday, and so I almost don't want to ask a specific question because I don't want to limit your response. But specifically, what were... we have to actually get to a point and ask her a question.
Well, let me just tell you, I actually wasn't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. I am a former person.
So when we talk about things like the future of Afghanistan, how can we make sure that women's rights are included, not as a side issue, not as a shadow issue, but as a fundamental part of the strategic plan forward, and that women's voices are really at the table in a very meaningful way?
What I did do yesterday was to participate in two panels about women, and one of them was on women in Afghanistan, and we had an Afghan woman with us, and we talked about this a lot. Obviously, the thing that has to happen is that the issue of women's rights has to be within whatever agreements are being made, and there is language, as I understand it, that is in fact dedicated to this idea that women's rights have to be supported. The thing that we brought up in the panel was that you can't have a trade-off between security and women's rights, and all of a sudden to say, well, we'll make a deal, because what we argued was that you can't really have good security and a future for Afghanistan if women are not involved at a variety of levels. There are women in the Loyal Jirga and in various places, but the question is what the rights of women are going to be. But what I found interesting is that there was this panel. Women were nodding to everything that we said about, it's really important to have nothing to be pushed backwards in terms of what women had achieved and how women's rights are protected. And then a woman in the audience gets up and starts yelling, NATO out, US out. There has to be some logic here in terms of the fact that what NATO is going to do between now and the time that the combat forces come out, and the ongoing political aspect is not disconnected from the women's issues. And so I think the thing people have to watch out for is not to do a trade-off on that, but it definitely is a subject, and I know that the person that was on the panel with me was Milan Verveer, who is the ambassador on all the women's issues that Secretary Clinton has set up. And Secretary Clinton, there is nobody more dedicated to those issues than Secretary Clinton. So it is very much a part of the discussion.
Bart?
Bart Shevchik from Wilmer Hale and George Washington University Law School. Madam Secretary, thank you for your remarks and the service to this country and to the world. My question is on R2P, and I wonder, what is your frank assessment of the real commitment to R2P across NATO? So during the Libya operation, there was quite a lot of dissensus as to whether R2P, first of all, was triggered, and second of all, whether it was in the national interest of the various countries involved. And even in the U.S., where there is quite intense commitment to the doctrine and to R2P, for instance, with the operation against Joseph Kony, the government went through a very intense debate internally over whether this fell within R2P and whether there was a U.S. interest involved, and then ultimately made the right decision. But I suppose institutions like the Atrocities Prevention Board are supposed to help facilitate those decisions to make them faster. So my question is, as you look across NATO, what is the level of commitment, real commitment, notwithstanding the rhetorical consensus? And secondly, do you envision, for instance, an APB in Germany, in France, in Canada, and throughout NATO to help facilitate a greater effectiveness of R2P? Thanks.
The answer is I don't know. I mean, the bottom line is the following. First of all, I think it is a complicated concept. And what is interesting is to go back again to the evolution. It really, the whole concept of the UN peacekeeping operations changed after the end of the Cold War. I mean, most of the peacekeeping operations had been literally peacekeeping, where the blue helmets went in and kept two sides apart after an agreement had been made. And then more evolution in terms of really peacemaking and being involved, and moving from peacekeeping to human security. And I mean, it's very, for students of international affairs, it's interesting to watch a concept evolve. And the countries that have been pushers in all of this are the Canadians, who are, I think, remarkable international citizens, the Australians through Gareth Evans, although interestingly enough, Gareth Evans was not that interested in doing much about Rwanda. But the bottom line is, as people change, and this concept of what was going on, I think it's very attractive in many different ways. Most of us, and I say this mostly about Americans, but I think it's true of many countries, that we are the most, Americans, I believe, are the most generous people in the world with the shortest attention span. And the bottom line is that, you want to do something, and then the issue is how to make it happen. And the responsibility to protect aspect is complicated by the sovereignty issue, and then the who is going to carry it out issue. So I think that is one of the major aspects, and where is it going to go? Then, and I think this goes back to your original question, is how do you today, when there are economic problems in all countries, persuade the people that something that is happening to people in some other country is of interest to them? And, we all try to figure out what the thread of our life is. And I've just written a book about what happened to Czechoslovakia at the beginning of World War II, where Neville Chamberlain said, "Why should we care about people in faraway places with unpronounceable names?" So the bottom line is, at this point, why should we care about people in X with unpronounceable names? And I think, for me, the issue is that we are all linked together. And it may be hard to persuade exactly that X leads to Y, but the bottom line, it does. And so that is the mission of our leaders at this point, is to try to explain why we should care about it. But it's a tough concept. It is a very tough concept. And it's interesting,